Okay, so this is Simplicity, Abstraction, and the Modern Website 10 years later. I'm Kevin Pittman, Web Services Architect for the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts at Georgia Tech. If you'd like to follow along with this presentation, the slides are available at https://webdev.iac.gotech.edu/presentations. So I always like to start with a little bit of background about myself so you understand where I'm coming from with this. I've been working in IT my entire life. I started out in computer lab support and then web application support in Georgia Tech Central IT. And 11 years ago, I moved over to the College of Liberal Arts to be their first full-time web developer. So with my student years at Georgia Tech, I've been with them for over 32 years, which means I'm old. But people who are old have a lot of experience to share with the people who are younger. I'm also a professional puppeteer with over 22 years of experience, so I'll definitely be adding a little bit of humor here and there as much as I can this early in the morning. A little bit about my college. So the College of Liberal Arts is one of 7 colleges at Georgia Tech. We have been around for 30 years, and at an institution like Georgia Tech, which is all about science and engineering, you may not think a lot about the liberal arts, but they are an important part. We like to think of ourselves as the glue that brings everything together, that adds the humanity to all of that science and engineering that people are doing. I came to the college in 2014. I was their very first full-time web developer. So before that, all the web design and development was not organized in any way. It was just the general IT staff trying to help the people who needed websites. And those sites were being developed by all kinds of people, most of which didn't know much about web design. We had, internally, we had faculty members, people like academic advisors and academic professionals who, are not supposed to be doing websites, but the school had nobody else to give it to, so they said, here, make a website for the school. Sometimes they passed it to staff members, like administrative assistants. That's a little better fit, but most of the time, they too did not have web design experience. They were trained in how to administer a unit. A lot of times that got passed down to a grad student or undergrad student as a project to do. And they too may not know a lot about the web, just enough to be dangerous. And then we had a few sites that were put together by small, like 1-person or 2-person outside development companies. And we didn't have any of these anything done by a big company like Acquia. It was always the small ones. And they had the most experience, but they didn't always know exactly what they were doing. So when I got in there and started looking at all these sites I had inherited, well, it was like a Wild West free-for-all, right? I realized nobody was following any rules. The unit leaders, they were just building these things the way they wanted them built without paying any attention to anything suggested by our Institute communications. And they were, like I said, in all kinds of different systems. Some were in WordPress, some were raw HTML. We had 3 that were in Drupal, but none of them had been built very well. It seemed like that was very much a time when people understood there was Drupal out there, but they didn't know how to use it right. They thought they did, but they didn't. So I started analyzing these sites. It's like if I'm going to come in, my main goal that I was given was standardize everything. Standard branding system, standard Drupal system on the back end, get everything the same. And of course, there was no standardization. That was problem number 1. Not even within sites. Sometimes different sections of a site would be set up in different ways that just didn't look cohesive with the rest of the site. There was too much complexity, too much functionality, too much data in one single site. It resulted in these things that I dubbed Franken sites. And I forgot to say, this is the morning, I forgot to say, I did a version of this presentation 10 years ago, as the title suggests. So some of this I'm going over are the things that I presented 10 years ago when I first started, after I had been working with these things for about 6 to 9 months. So I coined this term Franken-site back then. I don't know if it has been picked up and used in the common IT culture or not, but a Franken-site is any site built from a glob of disparate pieces or parts with the ill-conceived hope that they'll somehow work together to produce a usable and maintainable site. Not. It never works. But that's what people were doing. They tried to glob all these functionalities into the school site, and it was just a mess trying to get in there and figure out how anything worked. Trying to get these things upgraded was insane. One of the big problems 10 years ago was, keep in mind we were back in the days of things like Drupal 7. Drupal 7 didn't do landing pages well. It didn't do magazine-type layouts. It was pretty rudimentary back then. And we had a lot of sites in Drupal and otherwise where people had just clutched together something to look like a magazine-style front page. And you go in there and try to figure out how to update pieces of the text, and you couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Like, good luck. And part of that was the back-end systems. The file systems were totally cluttered, unorganized. There's some really crazy stuff that I'll talk about in just a moment, and I'm like, who trained these people? Or I guess they didn't get trained at all. They just tried to figure it out going in blind. I had to analyze all this and figure out, what are the core problems so that we can start addressing them and build new sites in a way that's going to be sustainable. That's my big thing, is I want a sustainable site. I feel like you do it right, you should be able to keep a site for 5 years or more. You shouldn't have to rebuild it every 1 to 2 years, but it has to be sustainable. Far too common, what I realized was going on was these leaders of the units, like the schools, the project centers, they wanted razzle-dazzle visual design. They'd see something somewhere else and go, oh, that looks so cool, I want this on our school site. But that was driving the project and costing us that sustainability. I broke it down into 4 problems that kind of come together to create the bigger problem, the perfect storm. You have these stakeholders who didn't appreciate how much technical debt they were asking for with what they wanted to do. Couple that with unskilled web developers. They didn't understand the limitations of what the CMS could do. Especially even in Drupal, it can do a lot because of this framework, but still the more you add to it, or if you try to go at it the wrong way, you can create a mess. Then you had these web developers not being comfortable talking back to the stakeholder, telling them, look, you're asking for something we can't produce. And a lot of that is the problem of, that person who's the stakeholder is also signing the check. So they want to get paid. and especially in something like Organization of Georgia Tech, even where there were rules coming from the upper levels, like Institute Communications, they weren't the ones signing the check, it was the school chair. So who are you going to listen to? People over here who aren't paying you, or the guy who's handing out your money, right? And that also brings out the other problem that there was no oversight. The college did not have anybody like me to oversee what was going on throughout the college, and Institute Communications didn't have the people power to go watch every site being built and tell folks, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that. So the stakeholders were able to pretty much get away with whatever they wanted. Another problem that I didn't realize back then, but I've seen it more and more over the past 10 years, there's way too much in higher education of just thinking in the here and now. Somebody wants to get a project center going. They want funding. They need to apply for donations and funding from other sources. And they just want to get that website up there now so they can point to that and say, this is what we're trying to do. and they're not thinking about how to maintain that site for 3, 4, 5 years. If they don't think about that, it's all too easy for them to direct whoever's building the site into designs and concepts that aren't going to be sustainable. You've got to get these people thinking about not just now, but how about next year, the year after that. So I came up with this idea that you've got to think about this as a marriage of visual and functional design. If you don't keep this principle in mind, you're going to quickly go down the wrong road. Visual and functional, they have to work in harmony. You can't let one forcibly dictate the other. The visual design needs to leverage the back end, but not overtax it, not ask it to do things it's incapable of doing. But the back end has to be strong enough and flexible enough to support what is being asked for by the visual. If it's too simple, too rigid, you're not going to get it to work. Visual design forcing bad functional decisions, you're going to get a brittle, fragile site. You're not going to be able to update it. And that's not just the content. Sometimes you can't update the code. You can't apply the patches because everything breaks every time you put the patch on. Bad functional back end is going to, forcing, letting the functional force bad visual designs is going to result in a site that the stakeholder doesn't like. It's not fitting their needs, and they think it's not what they ask for. So you've got to figure out how to bring that together. So I formulated this concept. It may seem a little cheesy, but things like this make it easier to remember what you're trying to remember, make it easier to tell others and get them to remember. The 4 principles of good website design: the strategy of abstraction-first design, the art of simplistic and intuitive landing pages, the virtue of documenting your website, and the joy of streamlining your back-end systems. Embrace all 4 of those, and you can make really great sites with whatever you're using. So I'm going to take each of these. I'm going to talk about what it is, what I was thinking when I put this together 10 years ago, how it's changed, or if it's changed, and how it's serving us today. So I'm going to kind of take us through the sweep on each of these 4 points. So the strategy of abstraction-first design. The idea here is to avoid building those giant Franken sites. Split things out as much as you can. And the first big thing you can do is to look at if you've got things like sub-units, sub-departments, or other areas that could split out to their own website. Think about the value of getting those split out so you don't have so many pages on one single site. That, again, smaller sites, easier to manage, easier to update. Even better, one of the things I worked on very hard was getting some utility sites going. Profiles, user profiles is a great example. We had 6 schools and the college site, and every one of them had their own set of profiles. And some of our project center sites had their own profiles. So some faculty members had as many as 4 profiles, and they're never updating even one of them, let alone 4. But you also had 4 sets of functionality, or 7 or more sets of functionality duplicated across both sites. And duplicate data, and it was just unnecessary. I created a central profile server, a standalone web server site that the faculty could log into and update their one sole profile for our entire college, and then a simple Drupal module that would pull in the information from that site and display it where it needs to be displayed, whether that was a listing of faculty or a single page about that one faculty member. That got all of that functionality pulled off of the individual sites. That functionality for editing and updating profiles, pictures, all that stuff got pulled down to one single site. I did similar things with news and events. We already had some centralized news and event aggregation, but I pulled everything that was being stored locally out of there so that it all came from a caching server. And that again simplified what was being stored on the individual sites. I pulled all our web forms off. I created either a standalone form systems where it worked. We also, about that time, got a Qualtrics license, which is a commercial form system. And so I started moving a lot of forms to Qualtrics. That gets rid of all that form functionality. We had photo galleries. I pulled them off into ZenPhoto. And so by the time I got through all of this, we had much simpler sites that were mostly focused on just standard HTML content. They could be patched just like that because I'm not trying to deal with maybe 30 modules that are attached to the site. I'm dealing with maybe 5 modules that do some core functionalities we need outside of what Drupal provides. I like to point out to people, folks say CMSs can be the Swiss Army knives of the web. But I say it's still better to do a few things well than a lot of things poorly. So you may get people pushing back when you start saying, oh, we should split things off. Some people can be that way. They think everything's got to be in one place. I had one person who just could not grasp the idea that people would not be confused if they got different URLs in their browser bar when they went to the sub-sites. And some people can be strange like that. I figure some of the best things to point out are the things that people are they're going to matter to people, security and uptime, and show them how that's going to help. It's better security because with the smaller sites, you can patch them faster, which means that you can get the patches out there for security to keep them safe. You can better control who can access what. When you have one big site, I'm sorry, but even today, it's kind of hard to control and say you can only edit these pages. Drupal just doesn't have a great system for that. There is the groups module, but I find even it's kind of awkward to handle that kind of thing. But if you've got separate sites, you just add users to only those sites they should edit. They've got their privileges. They can't touch anything else. It's never going to break. The utility sites, like our profile site, our news caching site, our web forms that are internal, they're all behind a hardware firewall. Nobody can get into that. Even if a bad patch comes through that might expose stuff, that doesn't matter. They're behind the hardware firewall. The outside world can't get to those things. If they were all loaded on your main public site, then you're solely relying on Drupal code to stay secure. And if something broke there and exposed the site, now everything on there is exposed. And those Franken sites, those gigantic Franken sites, I've seen it firsthand, or secondhand, I guess I should say. They just never get updated. Whoever's in charge tries to roll out some of the patches, they break. They have to pull it back. They try to fix some stuff. They roll it out, they pull it back. Sometimes I've seen it take a year just to get some patches out because the site just has too much on it. And every time they try to patch, something breaks. But uptime is another big thing. Once you simplify the stuff, you don't have to take the site down for as long to patch because the patches run much faster. You get them out quicker. Fewer internal dependencies means there's less things to break when you patch. And thus, easier patching, faster, less downtime. So that kind of stuff, I'm still embracing it to this day. I'm still trying to keep the sites as tight, as few modules as possible, as few bells and whistles, keep things split out. We are doing some bringing back in of small sites into the bigger one, but part of that is changes in internal dynamics. When I started, we had no central college communications unit as far as handling the web. They only handled college-level communications, and it was one person and her student assistant. And each school appointed someone, which is why we had faculty members and administrative assistants trying to do websites. We now have a central communications team for the college. And we have 2 people that do web as well as other tasks. We have our own social media for the whole college. We have several different people now working with our communications director. And that allows us to do some things we couldn't do before. And now it's starting to make sense. Take some of the smallest departments that had little websites that were too much trouble to maintain, bring them back in, give them a single page or two on the school site. So it always depends on, what kind of people you have to support these things. Moving on, the art of simplistic and intuitive landing pages. This is where we've seen the most win because so much has changed in the content management system world. Like I said, 10 years ago we had Drupal 7. There were no really good layout systems with Drupal 7 unless you built it yourself. As I started building sites, I built a layout system around paragraphs. Somebody pointed me to that and showed me what could potentially be done there, and it was the best thing I saw. So for many years we ran on paragraphs driving our page layouts up until Layout Builder was released and became ready for prime time. I think that was Drupal 9. And so with 9 we moved everything over to Layout Builder and have never looked back. And I'm keeping an eye now on Drupal Canvas. I don't think it's ready for prime time yet, but I can see a lot of potential in it. So with these proper layout tools, because also in WordPress, I know we're not a WordPress group, but we have to think about other things. WordPress has Gutenberg. They didn't have that back then. So our WordPress sites were just as bad as our Drupal sites, and people loading all kinds of third-party modules to try to do layout. And that's where this kind of stuff could bite you. People were loading these things in that really require extensive training to use, and they didn't have it, and they just barely got the site together. And then when anybody else had to take over, they couldn't figure out how to update the site because these things were so complex. If you ever saw panels for Drupal back in the Drupal 7 days, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It can be great in the hands of people who are trained to use it, when you have a dedicated, serious web developer to keep your site up to date. But in our world, we didn't have those kind of people. We have people who are communications first, and they need the simple stuff to be able to, keep their websites up to date. So even today, especially if you have to maintain any sites in WordPress, I don't think there's any of these for Drupal, but if there are, just keep your eye out for them. Avoid the stuff that tries to take over the entire editing experience and change it out. It may seem like a good idea, but here's the problem. Now you're no longer handing off a site that just needs somebody trained in Drupal. You're handing off a site that needs someone trained in Drupal that understands that third-party product. Now you've just limited the scope to a lot smaller group of people. And that makes it harder to find someone else to take over. Stick with the conventional. Build your sites with Layout Builder. Add modules that extend Layout Builder that don't go jumping off into completely new systems. A few other tips that I have pulled together from over the years. A reminder, don't force the CMS or theme package to do things it's not designed to do. I found this out very much the hard way. Today's hacker kludge always becomes tomorrow's massive headache. Unfortunately, it was somebody else's hack and kludge that became my massive headache when I took these sites over. Be honest with your stakeholder. Talk them through everything. Talk to them about what isn't going to work. Don't just, say yes to everything they ask for. Explain the things that aren't going to work and help guide them to the best site possible. When you're designing these sites out, it may seem like a nice, quick shortcut to just group some things together in the visual layout because they said they want it this way. Stakeholders always change their mind 4 or 5 or 10 times. So go ahead and break everything out the smallest units possible so you can quickly rearrange whenever you get them telling you, you know what, I'd rather this over here and this over here. Never put content into files meant to be templates. This was one of the biggest headaches I ran into because they couldn't figure out other ways to get these layout pages to look the way they want, landing pages to look the way they wanted. They go into the back end and they edit the HTML templates and they stick things in there. Well, guess what? How are you going to find where that is? Something like Drupal is a GUI-driven content system. So you're looking in the GUI for where this content is. But if it's sticking in a template file that you can only edit by logging into the file system, how you're supposed to figure out where it is and get it updated. So stay away from that. Templates should be just for structuring pages, not holding any kind of content. And avoid per block customizations. They can come back to bite too. You set that kind of thing up, and then someone looks at the page a couple years later and says, oh, I like the way that section works. Copy that over here and use it for this page. You copy it, but it doesn't render the same way because there's some special CSS sticking in there somewhere that customized it and you forgot all about how that works. If you've got to customize per block, at least document it. Put down somewhere some good, clear documentation on how it works so you can reproduce it later. So that's a perfect segue to the virtue of documenting your site. And this is the kind of thing that will never change, no matter how many years we go through. Why document? Trust me, you will forget. None of us are elephants. We will forget. Even the stuff you make yourself, 2-3 years later, you're going to forget if you haven't worked with it during that time and you've been building other sites and other systems. And then, of course, you got to eventually hand things off to other people, and they need to know how stuff works. I firmly believe the best documentation you can possibly do is self-documentation. Yes, you can write up documents and stick them somewhere, but what I found in practice is nobody can remember where they were stuck. Nobody can remember what file server they were put on. If you can't find the documentation, what's the good of having it? But if you self-document in the code, you'll never lose it. Unless you've lost the code, then you've got a much bigger problem. So what is self-documentation? It's designing your code with, in a way where the components clearly identify what they are. You don't have to guess at stuff. This is a long time practicing software coding. I go back to the 1980s. Now, back then, we didn't have much of a choice. We had to use short abbreviations because the computers couldn't handle long names and uppercase, lowercase, and all that stuff. It was really simple back then, but we don't have those limitations anymore. So give your variables descriptive names that really tell what they are, your functions, your methods, your class names, and then for everything that still doesn't explain itself when it's spelled out like that, inline comments. They're right there in the code. Sometimes you do have to do fancy logic that needs a little bit of explanation so others can understand why you're jumping around in the way you're doing. You can do this in something like Drupal. It's not impossible, and it's actually pretty easy to do. See, Drupal, if you start thinking about it, it's just a bunch of objects in the GUI. And when you look at them, you're giving a lot of these things names. You're giving them descriptions. Use that description field. It's there for a purpose. Can't tell you how many times I've gone into a Drupal site and trying to figure out what's going on, and there's nothing in the description field. Nothing to help me at all. But you can give things these really descriptive names. Instead of naming a menu object, just AP menu. What in the world does AP menu mean? You probably knew when you wrote that down, but will you remember 2-3 years later? Will somebody else understand? Probably not. Name it sidebar menu, academic programs. Now, anybody who looks at that knows it's an academic programs menu. It's going to be on the sidebar somewhere. It's clear. It's easy to follow. Instead of naming a block just events, name it front page block, upcoming events. Now you know exactly what it's holding, where it's supposed to be. You can track things backwards that way and see how everything fits together. The big thing is avoid these ambiguous one-word names for things like page, profile, about. I particularly hate about because technically about is a preposition. It needs an object. It should be about the center, about the school, about the college. And then, of course, a lot of the back end of Drupal that we build ourselves is still code, whether it's a module or a plugin, whether it's a theme, whether it's a template file in Twig or CSS code or JavaScript code. It's all programming code. You can apply this to every one of them. Add in make sure your descriptors are, make sure your identifiers are very descriptive. Make sure you have the inline comments. I spent a lot of time with this, and it has really come back to help. When I've had to go back, like into CSS, and make some changes, the code, the way I write it, where I've got really clear comments about what each section is doing, and the really long but clear and descriptive identifiers, I've been able to jump in and make those changes like 10 times faster than I could in the past. Because in the past, I was trying to decipher what others had done, and none of it made any sense. And then the joy of streamlining back-end systems. The key point here is keep your workspace tidy from the start, then do like the chefs and clean as you go. You'll never have enough time at the end of a project to clean things up the right way. I saw this problem firsthand with 2 of the Drupal sites I was handed. They had been built by one of those one-person outside development companies. This person left 150 modules in the modules directory. Did not clean any of this stuff up that she didn't need. I guess her idea of building a site was just dump in everything she might possibly ever use and then turn on the things that she ended up using. Well, that may not seem like a huge deal. You might say, oh, well, it's not necessary, but it actually can cause huge problems. I learned this the hard way. We had a reg array go bad. When a reg array goes bad, it doesn't just die. It gets very, very slow. Or at least it did back in those days. It may not be as noticeable with modern RAID, but back then it would get very slow. Drupal, I discovered, has this function that wants to go scan every file in every module directory looking for modules, because it allows for modules to be nested underneath each other, submodules and sub-submodules. So imagine how many files were sitting there with 150 modules, not even including the ones that came with Drupal. And these sites would not even render a page anymore while the RAID was bad. I had to go in and manually start removing stuff and ripping stuff out, get it down to the bare minimum so I could just get the site usable. And then I started trying to clean out other things that could be cleaned out until we got it where it would render halfway decently until we got the new drive for the RAID. So some important principles here. Don't install anything until you know you need it. Don't go experimenting with the site you're going to hand in, to the stakeholder. Have a separate site if you want to experiment with a module and see whether it does something useful or not. And if it doesn't do anything useful, well, you haven't contaminated the site that you're going to actually push live. And when you realize you don't need something, if you end up putting it on that site that you're planning to push live, and then you realize, okay, there's a better way to do this now, make sure you pull that off as quick as possible. Don't keep putting it off. That's the easiest way for it to just end up staying there and taking up space when you're not even using it. Use consistent naming schemes. I know some people will say, oh, I'll just put my custom modules in a custom directory and the third-party ones in the contrib directory, and that can kind of sort of work, but there are places where they all get grouped together in listings, and so I find it works much better if you use a standard naming scheme. I use prefixes to identify everything I wrote that's custom module, and then I can look at that identifier and see that these are all my custom ones, as opposed to being some kind of third-party one. Keeping scholars and archive and backup files out of your web hosting root or anywhere under it that's published to the world. The Drupal docs tell you not to do that, and a lot of that is because it can conflict with Drupal sometimes, but it's also, quite frankly, it can be a security issue. Not only does it clutter it up, and not only does it sometimes break Drupal, but you could expose things unwittingly. If someone found a way to hack into the site just enough to get directory listings and see what's there, well, that's all they would need to download a file that's in the public space. And if that, say, is an archive file that happens to include some of your config files, boom, they just got your passwords. If it can show them things like versions of modules that are running, it might give them clues to other things they can hack if they know that a certain version has a certain vulnerability. So don't leave anything in there that could give away useful information to the hackers. Store all that stuff outside the web root where it can never be accessed over the web. When you get the chance to upgrade a site where you can actually take a clone of it and work with that for a while, sometimes we're in situations where we have to upgrade on the fly. We have to plan everything and do it in a half-hour period because the site just can't be down. But where you have a chance to take your time upgrading a site offline and then push the whole thing out, very first thing you should do, audit the thing. Go through everything in the site and clean it out. Do it first. Like I said before, you never wind up with enough time at the end of the process. And it's not just auditing the content. There is so much in Drupal that can build up in so many places. Look at the taxonomies. Look at the blocks. Look at the media. Look at all those types, block types, media types. A lot of that stuff gets created and then doesn't need to be used anymore. And if you can clean that stuff out, you have a much simpler site. And then, of course, look at the user accounts, the roles, all that security stuff. Make sure that's all tightened up. And the people who left 2 years ago don't still have accounts on the site. Look at the modules and the themes. Make sure they make sense. See if there's new ways of doing things that are better. And get rid of the ones that actually aren't being used. If you start at the beginning, you have that entire development period to discover if you remove something that still needs to be there. If you try to clean everything up at the very last moment, it's not going to be discovered until the site's pushed out live and the stakeholder goes, what happened to X? And now you have to go back and find it and put it back out there. Never load content files into the file system. I doubt anybody's doing that anymore, but I'll still mention it. It just works so much better when you have your files attached to whatever's using them. And in Drupal these days, whether or not everybody realizes it, you can add a file field to all sorts of things, not just a content page or node, but you can add it to blocks, you can add it to media, just about anything that works with the field system, you can add a file attachment field. So use that, and then you know where that file is being used. And if that element is deleted, then the reference goes away. Ideally, Drupal would clean it up, but I don't think they even now have ever gotten file cleaning fully working right. But you can at least use one of these tools that checks all that stuff. It will go through all those file fields and tell you how many references there are still active. And you can use that to see if there's files you can get rid of. Because it is bad to leave attachment files out there. They can come back to haunt you if it has something that suddenly becomes sensitive when it wasn't in the past. We've had that happen a few times, and we've had to go track it down. Nobody thought the file was still available, but Google will hold on to links to things that are actually in the file system, even if a page is not referencing it anymore. So, and if you just put your files right in the file system, directly upload them through SSH, then you have no tracking of who's using it for what. So, what's changed 10 years later? There have been some changes. I've talked about a few along the way. In general, one of the biggest things is that these content systems have gotten hugely complex compared to 10 years ago. Think about Drupal. 10 years ago to now. Now Drupal is managed by Composer, full of object-oriented coding. It's got Layout Builder. It's got Canvas. Canvas is almost like an ecosystem to itself when you start digging in there and looking at what it does. All this complexity adds more challenge to keeping a site safe and secure and sustainable. WordPress has gone the same way. They've added Gutenberg, they've added more object-oriented. It's amazing sometimes when I go in there and look at a WordPress site and I think about what it was like when I first got there to the college 10 years ago. It's almost a completely different world now. The page layout systems are far superior to 2014 technologies. So that changes a lot of how we think about how we approach building sites. A lot of our sites now, just about every page is some kind of magazine style layout. Back then, we were keeping that to just like the front page and section top pages because it was too expensive, too costly to try to do that for everything. People are finally taking accessibility seriously, at least in my world. The ADA laws seem to be pushing that more than anything. And it's an interesting change because I've been a proponent of accessibility for a long time, but I've seen it kind of waver. Something would happen in the news, some school somewhere would get sued under the traditional laws, and everybody would perk up. And we start getting some things from up above about we need to do this and that. And then it would kind of die off, and then it would come back again and die off. So I mostly figured this stuff out and pushed a policy to my college of this is what we need to be doing. And it's worked well. Now we're suddenly getting real interest from up above, and it is a good thing, except it doesn't always line up exactly what I've been telling them because everybody looks at accessibility differently. There is no one true right way to do it. We're moving more and more sites to WordPress. The campus policy has become put small sites on WordPress. Only use Drupal for things like school sites, college sites, top administrative sites. And so we're heavily utilizing multi-site WordPress. And that's one of the things I think Drupal really ought to look into is, figuring out a way to provide a GUI-based multi-site Drupal setup so you can have one Drupal server and have dozens of Drupal sites and can manage it like WordPress through a GUI. Right now, as far as I know, the only way you can manage multi-site Drupal is going in the command line and creating a new directory and manually setting up the settings files. And that's, decades away from what WordPress can do. Some lessons learned. We're almost to the end. I know everybody likes lessons learned. Standardization is a lot harder than it looks. I thought it would be pretty easy to go in there, set up some standards, and tell everybody this is what we're doing. It doesn't work that way when you're talking to school chairs and other high-level faculty running project centers. They don't always want to hear this from you. And when you have a college with 6 schools, you've got 7 opinions that are different and rarely mesh well together. I had to do a lot of compromising along the way. Thankfully now, 10 years later, everybody pretty much buys into standardization without much pushback. Some of it, I think, is that, or at least I'm going to believe, I greased the wheels really well coming along. But also having a strong central college communications team helps too. They get out there, they talk with them. Our college communications director gets involved a lot more than back in the old days. And I think that helps get everybody to agree to the standardization. Of course, the third thing that helps is just every one of our chairs has changed out over the years. And when a new chair comes in, I think we're a little more willing to accept the status quo than someone who was already there when someone like me comes in and says, y'all need to standardize. Know your weight. I'm going to be honest. I'm chopped liver. I'm not in an administrative position in an institute like Georgia Tech. They don't have very many high-level positions that are not supervisory, where you supervise other people, and I don't want to do that. So I've gone up about as high as I can get, which doesn't really give me much sway and say in how things are done. But I know who to go to put pressure on people if they don't want to willingly go along with the standards I'm telling them we need to follow. I'll go to my IT director. I'll go to my communications director. If necessary, we'll go up to the college dean. Use tools like that to get people to do what they need to do. Don't just try to fight the battle on your own because you'll probably lose. And that strong communications team helps. I see a lot of difference having them there to help me, but it changes things too. I used to be one out there talking to the school chairs and talking to the project directors and so forth, and I'm realizing recently I haven't even met any one of our current chairs. They've all changed out, and the communications team is doing all of that interaction with them. So I'm seeing better websites because we're getting better support all the way around, but at the same time, my role has changed a lot in 10 years, for better or for worse. But in conclusion, in spite of everything, in spite of all the change, I still see this philosophy holding true. I'm still following it. I'm still benefiting from it. I see time and again when I have to go in and work with a site, how much easier it is now than it was 10 years ago. So I strongly recommend following the strategy of abstraction-first design, the art of simplistic and intuitive landing pages, the virtue of documenting your website, and the joy of streamlining back-end systems. That's my presentation. If there's any questions, we can eke out a couple of minutes, I think.
There is a multi-site building situation in the GUI called Acre that's been up and down over the last 15 years or something. And it kind of mostly works sometimes.
What's the spelling for that?
AEGIR. They're working on a new version and trying to get somebody to fund it. So it's there. Sort of.
Then also speaking of the documentation and standards, as you know, in the last couple of years, AI-assisted coding has really blown up, and a lot of people do a lot of things really fast. What are you seeing as far as like either enforcing or running into problems with standards with this new AI trend?
To be totally honest, I have stayed far, far away from AI. I'm just one of those anti-AI people, I'll be honest. I don't know how that's going to play into things. I'm going to be honest, I'm trying to dance around it because I'm hoping to retire in the next few years, and I won't have to worry about it. I'm not going to do IT after I retire.
Yeah, because like we've had one potential client project coming up where he's like, dude, like I've already vibe coded this thing, but like, I know there's something I'm missing here, like help me out. And it is interesting. I expect we'll see a lot more of this sort of thing in the future.
I can imagine, if the AI is generating a lot of this code, that's going to be tricky for how you document it when you didn't even make it yourself. I don't know. That's definitely got to be part of the questioning and the figure policy making as to how AI code gets used in projects. I definitely am a big proponent of do not rush into that stuff. Take the time to figure out the best ways to use it before you start actually using it.
So one thing I do is I know guiltily, I use Claude to create some code, but what I also, as part of an agent, I also have it to create, like if it's a function for something, I said also include comments of what this function does, and it just adds it straight in the module, like if I'm doing a custom module or something like that. And so like you were saying is, don't create a separate document, add all these things in it makes, of course it adds lines to your module or whatever, but the information's there. Every bit of code can be explained. So even if you need to go back and years later, hopefully, if they're clear, which I make sure that they're clear to understand, it's useful. absolutely. And so they're gonna be looking at the comments too, and going like, okay, what is this really doing? So there's always some checks and balances to human interaction with all those things, because it's not something we want to, just like you said, just create it and set it and forget it type thing.
Are there any things, you mentioned you're planning to retire in a couple of years, are there any things in this simplicity and abstraction that you have as goals to get this into like a nice state before you retire? Are there things that you still think we can work on in terms of keeping an ecosystem like this running smoothly?
I don't know. We'll just have to see as time goes by. And I start ramping down, and one of our big problems is going to be that this is not the kind of environment where they can hire someone to work beside me. So I'm going to have to just leave things as they are, and then a few months later they'll hire someone, and that person will have to figure it all out. Good luck.
Hopefully with a good documentation.
All right, well, I need to wrap this up so that
Thank you.